I make videos on speculative fantasy world building, and oftentimes I miss the mark. I get disgruntled comments suggesting that maybe I've missed a critical factor, I've misinterpreted Tolkien's original intent perhaps, or I've not read, seen or discussed one of the myriad pieces of media which go against my point. And I appreciate all of these comments, I really do, even, the nastier ones which kind of go with the territory of having opinions on the internet. But there is one type of comment which really gets to the core of my own psyche. Why am I even talking about fantasy at all? It's confession time. My favourite book is a collection of all 5 of the stories of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. My favourite George R.R. Martin text is Tough Voyaging, a spacefaring anthology following a sociopath with a love of cats through space. I've never read a single D&D novelisation, and frankly, Tolkien's prose did not grip me. Goodness, most of my videos place magic or some fantasy concept under great scrutiny, almost as if it were a technological advancement, examining impacts, effects and social consequences, turning esoteric magic into the hard rules of how a world functions. Add to all this a serious interrogative tone, a preference for settings which escape medievalism, and my shared loves for psionics and time travel, bolstered I'm sure by a lifelong love for Doctor Who, and by all rights, I really should be talking about science fiction. Spacefaring, time-warping adventures with blasters and planets, starships, aliens and technocratic dystopia. So what gives? Why do I discuss fantasy speculative world building when all of my greatest loves point towards science fiction? Well, I believe that there is a problem at the heart of science fiction, which does strengthen the genre in some ways, but creates a very significant gap in its accessibility in some other ways. And before you click off the video, let me pose you a question. What does a generic science fiction setting look like? Your instincts may be spaceships, interplanetary contact, green aliens and laser guns, with some great evil technocratic empire crushing the dreams of the common man. But that's basically Star Wars, and isn't representative of science fiction greats like 1984. Dune, which doesn't really heavily feature aliens, for example. The Martian, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And Nightfall. You may at this point be thinking that I'm being reductive. Surely, with a long enough list of what is considered generic, you could use it like a checklist and eliminate any piece of media that does not feature all of these things, thereby eliminating it from the genre, triumphantly declaring that there's no such thing as horror. And fair point. I'm not here to argue that science fiction has no defined genre convention, that it's somehow impossible to pin sci-fi down into one specific form because there's so many different types, because that is true of every genre, including fantasy. Urban fantasy, high fantasy, sword and sorcery, epic fantasy, cozy fantasy, romantasy, they're all very different. Heck, Star Wars itself is arguably just a high-tech fantasy setting, as, again, arguably is Dune. And both of these are set at opposite ends of time itself. This is why speculative fiction is such a helpful term. Once we leave the realm of history or reality and introduce magic or, sufficiently advanced technology, we're on our own, working speculatively to build a world that it feels reasonable, rational perhaps, or just consistent. The genre of speculative fiction is about speculating from the core assumptions of a world setup. It is the base assumptions of a world that set the context for its tone, its narrative, and its world building. The world of Pokemon assumes that powerful elemental beasts have always coexisted with humans, that humans have had the ability to tame and possess such beasts since ancient times, and that this has produced a high-tech society using these creatures which is fairly utopic. From these base assumptions, we can then extrapolate that such a world may offer free healthcare to its citizens and indeed its Pokemon or elemental beasts, and that society may shift towards exploiting the labor of these Pokemon for recreational and labor purposes. And given that these Pokemon have a propensity to fight one another in the wild, one might assume that a form of blood sport may develop, which gives us the modern Pokemon world. In fantasy, our assumptions are already usually fairly well codified. We understand that goblins are generally quite nasty and mischievous little guys, who are small in stature, kind of a greenish colour, and act like feral gremlins. We understand that elves are usually tall and lithe. They live longer than other creatures, have pointy ears, and are generally detached or aloof. But what does an alien look like? An even more specific question, what does a Martian look like? Little green or grey men? Sure, sometimes. But in Doctor Who, they're bulky reptilian warriors. In The War of the Worlds, they're octopus-like. And The Martian Chronicles depicts them as small, brown telepaths who wear intricate masks and have shape-changing abilities. Of course, again, there are also presentations of elves that don't follow the traditional model of what an elf is. Perhaps they are intentionally subversive from the traditional normal mold in fantasy, or perhaps they take more from folklore and folk tales than Tolkien does with his kind of semi-angelic representations. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of fantasy does indeed come either in opposition to or in concert with this process of taking folklore and folk tales and morphing them with human history and genre conventions. Science fiction, on the other hand, does not quite have its own established mythological playbook. The classic sci-fi texts are Frankenstein and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Or if we're being really nerdy, we could stretch this to the true history of Lucian of Samosata from the 2nd century AD. Compared to the Epic of Gilgamesh and the myriad of folk stories passed through entire cultures that are no longer with us over generations through oral traditions, and science fiction just doesn't have as solid a mythological grounding or playbook to draw from. Fantasy, therefore, has had a lot longer to solidify its assumptions, its settings, its tropes, and its creatures. Critically, fantasy has mythology and folklore to act as stabilizing ground upon which assumptions can be made. Science fiction, on the other hand, has the accepted canon of its own works, like fantasy has as well. And then, it only really has the scientific, technological, and sociological conditions and base understandings that exist in the moment of its production. And just as a quick reminder, scientific consensus is constantly shifting. This is not stable ground upon which to build assumptions. This is why science fiction's aesthetic is often changing with the zeitgeist, from sleek minimalism to maximalism, and it's why science fiction's representations of the future often feel so tied to the modern present, the modern immediate future, or the recent past, with neo-futurism and retrofuturism, both very popular aesthetics within the genre, both borrowed from aesthetic trends within the 20th century. So what? Thus far, all I've actually been able to argue is that fantasy, as opposed to science fiction, has a more concrete and established set of generic assumptions that can be drawn for that exist in a more stable ground. Here's where I'd like to intersect this discussion with some of my own personal interests: tabletop role-playing games and world building. The former is a collaborative medium, which requires all players, including the game master, to have a shared understanding of the set of assumptions that exist about the world in which the game is set. Much of table incompatibility and drama within the TTRPG space comes from players entering into games without having understood the shared assumptions of the world or setting or game system that they are playing within. Like it or not, for the last 50 years, Dungeons & Dragons has been establishing a broadly homogeneous set of assumptions for play within the TTRPG fantasy space, which through Dragon Quest, fantasy anime, Critical Role, and most recently Baldur's Gate 3 have managed to percolate into the fantasy zeitgeist to such an extent that these assumptions are a baseline for what one can expect from a fantasy TTRPG game. And this is not only helpful in playing to type, but also playing against type. It allows other games and systems to define themselves by what D&D doesn't do. This is darker, this is more complex, this has a greater focus on personal relationships. Another piece of evidence for this homogeneity of fantasy genre expectation or assumption comes when we see multiple great creatives working within the confines of 5th edition to introduce new elements using that system. From kaiju battles to spacefaring, from romance to intrigue. D&D, specifically D&D 5th edition, kinda has an unofficial supplement for everything. Now, don't get me wrong. I know that there are generic science fiction systems out there, from M-Space to GURPS or Traveller's sci-fi offerings to Stars Without Number, all of which offer setting-agnostic science fiction play experiences. But there's also something of a selection bias in play. Do we include psionics, space travel, spaceship combat, time travel? Are our mechanics more focused on spacefaring or a more granular neo-noir setup? Are there mechs? These are all staples of different kinds of science fiction. And where D&D is well established as a kitchen sink style fantasy and hangs together about as well as a kitchen sink nailed to a wall, science fiction doesn't quite mesh together all of these disparate concepts very much in the same world, often. Unless you count having like different sectors of space delineated for each of these genres of sci-fi. In a grand universe, the 40k corner sits quite far from the Star Wars corner, with Federation space being millions of light years away. And Old Earth maybe sits as some sort of ancient backwater, using scraps of ancient civilization to build mechs to fight for what is left of the apocalyptic wasteland. I mean, it kind of works. It is what D&D tries to do with its planes of existence, for example. But this in itself is not an issue. It's not news to many of us that D&D has achieved a cultural hegemony in fantasy that is only rivaled by properties maybe like Star Wars. But what may be novel is considering this impact on world builders and world building, and how this intersects with TTRPGs. Homebrewing and making your own game world is something of a rite of passage for many first-time game masters. It allows you to set the parameters of your own fantasy, to create your own space in which to encapsulate your players' actions, and through the medium of collaborative storytelling, share it with others and make it part of a living, breathing world. And the simple fact of the matter is, when it is the sole responsibility of the game master to impart what this world is like to the players, when they are the only point of contact between the players and the imagined world, it gets a lot harder to communicate effectively and indeed to create a living, breathing world without a set of shared assumptions. Star Wars has a really popular TTRPG space, largely because playing within the world of Star Wars gives you a certain set of known assumptions to everyone at the table that you can just get the game going with. The Forgotten Realms is so popular for the exact same reason. It gives you a set of assumptions. You can be a cleric and pick from a list of deities, find which one you vibe with, and just move on. If playing in the Star Wars world or in the Forgotten Realms, game masters always invent their own locations, their own quests, their own individual things to do, placing them in the world, but using the shorthands and shared assumptions of Jedi and Drow to help things along. But science fiction specifically exists as a commentary on trends within current-day science and works extrapolatively from concepts to create a unique feeling world. Faster-than-light travel has been solved or bypassed thousands and thousands of different times in thousands of different ways across myriad properties. Because an explanation of this, or at least a very solid handwave, is the grounding, the specific grounding by which we can have starships. It's the same as magic in fantasy. There are thousands and thousands of different explanations about how magic works. Each property has its own take. The only difference is that magic has been present in our religions, our myths, our worldviews, and our material reality throughout the entire history of human civilization. It's an accepted part of our most ancient and well-respected of tales. It's fundamental. FTL travel is a science fiction concept only. It refers only to itself, specifically in the science fiction canon. We have no personal, philosophical, or practical links to it in our real world outside the realms of theoretical physics and science fiction stories. This means that there is no accepted shorthand when world building. Even in such irreverent works as The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, FTL is explained. Granted, it's by the infinite improbability drive or bistromathics, two wonderful, sensibly absurd systems. But I would challenge someone to find me a book in which the true FTL travel was inside you all along. You see what I mean? So to bring this all to a close, then, I believe that fantasy, specifically, holds a critical advantage in enabling casual or amateur world building, especially in collaborative storytelling and world building environments. In part due to the existence of an external canon of legends, monsters, and folk tales that can be drawn from and can act as a fundamental grounding for the assumptions of the world, and in part due to the sheer indebtedness of the genre to Tolkien's specific presentation of fantasy. If your elves don't look like his, you're either using a different folkloric interpretation, or you're making a deliberate choice to do something different. In contrast, science fiction's lack of a generic grounding, its reliance on its own canon, especially when mixed with the ever-changing nature of real-world technological progress, is actively harmful for the amateur and deleterious for the collaborative storyteller. But this aspect of science fiction does have benefits as well. Science fiction stories specifically are often associated with the realm of the auteur, Frank Herbert, H.G. Wells, Isaac Asimov, largely because the greats pretty much only exist in conversation with each other, and because there is a tendency to try and reinvent the wheel with each new scientific discovery, provoking a new spiraling path of speculation, and with each new story having little grounding to rely on, so needing to reinvent itself from the ground up. As such, science fiction has generally received more prestige attention than fantasy, specifically in amongst the speculative fiction bubble. It also makes the genre better, in my opinion, at commenting on the status of the real world right now, as the real world situation is almost always arguably an inflection point, a key one for science fiction, where it is not so for fantasy. But this does not necessarily make for an amateur comfortable foray at a TTRPG table. Is it a blaster, phaser, ray gun, laser pistol, proton pack, death ray, or laser gun? Goodness knows. But that big, ugly brute with muscles the size of your head and a propensity for violence with green-grey skin, well, that's an orc. And in a situation where an orc or a blaster is an immediate threat, those threats need to be immediately communicable. Familiarity, genre convention, and a shared understanding of what certain things visually look like can be a real help. So because science fiction so often builds from the ground up, builds its own assumptions from the ground up anew each time a new world is built, and because fantasy is able to have a longer historic presence of a shorthand by which to discuss its main themes, that is why I believe that fantasy role-playing games occupy a wider space within the TTRPG community. That, I believe, is a problem that might need to be solved for science fiction to enjoy the same generic popularity as fantasy, D&D styled fantasy does in this specific space. But it may also be the reason why fantasy is often so maligned in critical circles. It's very obviously all singing from the same hymn sheet, unless it's specifically choosing to do something different. But I think I shall close the episode there. Hopefully I haven't ruffled all of the feathers in the world, and my arguments have made some degree of sense. My hope is always to communicate something that is at least interesting, if not agreeable. and I hope I've at least explained my point effectively. Please do sound off in the comments, because I feel like this is a really interesting discussion that I do want to hear other people's opinions on. So do let me know how you feel about that, especially if you are specifically within the science fiction side of the TTRPG scene. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.